A young mother was having some difficult time with her small child, and after a day of endless frustration caused by many unheeded thou shalt nots, she grabbed her offspring and forcefully put him in a chair with a warning that he stays seated until given permission to move. Well, her youngster bristled with rebellion and then said through puckered up lips, "I may be sitting on the outside, but I'm standing on the inside." In like manner, God expects submission to his revealed will. Yet we seem to just resist his authority somewhat like this defiant child. Maybe it would be easier for some to serve God more if God had made doing right appear to be doing wrong. But really, if God desires meek compliance, why didn't he just simply program us as non-thinking robots who had no choice, no alternative but to obey? Why make us as free moral agents with the choice to choose to rebel against his will if we so desire? Well, God has not revealed all of the secrets to us, Deuteronomy 29:29. However, we can see a possible explanation by considering how a human father deals with their children. An adult, because of his greater size, can use brute strength and make the child obey his every whim. He could punish each infraction hastily and severely. The youth would go through every rigorous command with an outward submission, but have a deep hatred inside towards his old man. On the surface, an obedient offspring, but neither the parent or the youngster would have a spirit of joy or mutual satisfaction. Inwardly, the adolescent would be experiencing hostile resentment. However, a child, even though having the ability to rebel, could love his father if his dad's actions are positive towards him, and may even say, "Hey, Pop, what would you like for me to do to please you today?" It is not difficult to see in which situation the father would have the greater reason for happiness in his child. Well, so it is with God. Having created us with the capability as free moral agents to either defy him or obey him. And when we voluntarily love him back in obedience, God finds greater jubilation in our service than if we had no choice. Psalms 147 verse 11. The Lord favors those who fear him, those who wait for his loving kindness. Now listen closely. As there is a difference between technical obedience and loving obedience. It is the spirit of loving obedience that we are going to examine this morning in our lesson, especially as it suggests about the Old Testament character named Caleb. Now, Old Testament Joshua is someone who's often taught in our children's Bible class, but not so much is said of Caleb. He is sort of an unsung hero. But listen to God in Numbers 14:24. But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Now that different spirit, I believe, is the spirit of loving obedience. That's why God, who is able to read the inner parts of men, could proudly proclaim, Caleb is not going through the motions of following me with technical obedience, but is following me fully in loving obedience with all his body, his heart, his mind, and soul. Now, what is the setting behind this great tribute which God paid to Caleb? After all, God does not spend a lot of time bragging on humankind. Well, our story is recorded in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. After deliverance from Egyptian bondage, the people were ready to enter the land which God had promised. Now a man from each tribe, 12 in all, formed a search committee to spy out the new land and then to return with their report. The land was great with milk and honey that was flowing, but the giants possessed it, and therefore it is not possible for us to take. But Caleb, speaking for self, and Joshua says it can be taken with God's help. Yet the other 10 spies had swayed the children of Israel to their negative thinking. So they wanted to do away with Moses. They wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb and return to Egypt. Now God is ready to destroy these murmurers, but Moses intercedes and says, what will the outsiders think? So God chose to pardon them, but denied the blessing of possessing the land to all except those under 20 years of age, as well as Joshua and Caleb, because of their spirit of obedience. The slanderous complainers did die along the way for the next 40 years in the wilderness wandering. Their bones were all bleached out by the hot sun. But Joshua and Caleb, God spared of the original generation, and they did take the land just as God had promised. Well, what are some of the wonderful lessons that can be learned from this event, suggested by the spirit of obedience in Joshua and Caleb? First off, the spirit of obedience requires us to do God's will promptly. Numbers 13, verse 30. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. At once means being quick and obeying the truth of God. New Testament Saul, when learning the gospel truth, obeyed immediately. In Acts 9, verse 18, he arose and was baptized. Not like the wayward church member who was pushed down an aisle by another and then said reluctantly to the preacher, all right, I am willing for you to pray for me, but don't let it take effect until Tuesday. I go before a judge tomorrow, and I don't want to be at a disadvantage in case I have to tell a lie or use profanity. We, with the spirit of obedience, will do God's will quickly, without delay. Secondly, the spirit of obedience requires us to obey even when others are not obeying. The 10 spies that went out with Joshua and Caleb did not share the same conviction concerning obedience. They persuaded the Jews to murmur and to desire in going back to Egypt under a new leadership. Now, beginning in Numbers 14, verse 6 to 9, Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, the land which we pass through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. These two men of faith, Joshua and Caleb, pleaded that the Israelites not be rebellious, but submit to the Lord, knowing that the God was with them. However, verse 10, but all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Today, we are to be as Joshua and Caleb by obeying even if others refuse, and do not do right by even persecuting us for our one true faith. Matthew 10 teaches that Jesus did not bring peace on earth, but a sword when we obey the word of God. This Bible places one against another. In chapter 10, verse 22, and Jesus says, "You will be hated by all on account of my name, but it is the one who endures to the end who will be saved." Now, if you don't believe what Jesus said, then seriously attempt to take the New Testament gospel to your unsaved family and friends, and then notice their reaction to you. And if you have been a New Testament Christian for a few years and have never done so, then shame on you, because you are not enduring to the end, but you are a secret disciple. Why is it that we allow disobedience of others to determine whether we obey God or not? Christians have left Christ when a loved one refuses to obey. They have quit Jesus when their feelings were hurt. We just make all sorts of excuses for not remaining faithful to the Lord. In Luke chapter 14, 16 to 18, Jesus says, "A certain man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. And at the dinner hour, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses." Jesus then listed 3 flimsy excuses that were given. Bought a piece of land and need to go see it. Bought 5 yoke of oxen and need to go try them out. Got married recently and need to stay home. The last fella is already henpecked. But this parable is during supper, or it's after the sun has set. So you don't check out property or plow in the dark of the night. And the newlywed husband, he needs a free unburnt meal. They that had already been invited all made excuses so as not to have to attend the prepared dinner. Mark Twain was approached by a man wanting to borrow his hatchet, which Twain did not like to lend out. And having no good reason not to, he said, "I can't. I must use it to eat soup with." Well, the fella looked with curiosity. He replied, "Mr. Twain, you don't use a hatchet to eat soup." Well, Twain, in his typical wit, said, "I know, but when you're making an excuse, one is just as good as another." Brethren, folks will make any excuse for not coming to the Lord and then remaining obedient. And in God's sight, their maneuver is about as reasonable as eating soup with a hatchet. Now, continuing in Luke chapter 14, Jesus says of those who make excuses, "None of these men who were invited shall taste of my dinner." Verse 24. Those that do not obey, even because they allow others to hinder them, simply will not receive the joy of heaven. Thirdly, the spirit of obedience requires us to disregard comfort and personal preference in doing God's will. The land of Canaan was promising, but the presence of greater sized men and other obstacles was disturbing to the Israelites, who wanted the blessing without any inconvenience, the reward without a sacrifice. But Caleb's spirit was different. Again, verse 9, "Do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. They will be made to serve us. Their protection has been removed from them. There is nothing that can stop us." Caleb understood there was diligent effort with our pouring sweat in doing God's will. However, the labor would be well worth any price they had to pay to obtain this promised land. Many have the spirit of obeying only select commands of God. Ones that don't cost us anything, or those that we might get something out or from it. Old Testament King Saul learned that the practice of partial obedience, no matter for what reason, is not full obedience. In 1 Samuel 15, he was told clearly to utterly destroy the Amalekites and their possessions. Yet he didn't. So the prophet Samuel corrects the situation in verse 23. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. Fourthly, the spirit of obedience does not permit us to reject commands that we do not understand. It did not appear on the surface to be logical that God would expect his beloved children to possess a land whose inhabitants made the Israelites look like they were grasshoppers to step on. It would be like a school teacher sending you out as a little child onto the playground with a bunch of mean bullies waiting in the shadows for you to leave the grown-ups' side. The Israelites' human reasoning had blinded them to the fact that God had robbed these pagan people of their defense and intended them to be a source of gathering food for the Hebrew nation. But the Jews had trusted in their own wisdom and did not comprehend. Therefore, they blew it for the next 40 years. God has often commanded things that appear to be foolish to men, but it is done as a test of faith, and when obeyed, God receives the glory and not man. In the military encounter against Amalek in Exodus 13, as long as Aaron and Hur held up the arms of Moses holding his staff, Joshua and Israel prevailed on the battlefield. Or in the fall of Jericho and its strategy. In Joshua chapter 6, they were to march around the city one time per day for 6 days. And on the seventh day, they would to march 7 times. Now all of this was to be done in silence, and then there's going to be a long blast from a ram's horn, and then the people are to shout at the top of their lungs, and the city will be theirs. The cleansing of Naaman's leprosy in 2 Kings chapter 5. The power is not in the water, or all lepers could be healed. Or sending Jesus into the world to die on the cross with a plan of salvation which includes water immersion looks to those who are perishing foolishness. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 18. What God approves, man oftentimes rejects. Peter in Acts chapter 2 tells the Jews that Jesus was sent by God performing miracles before your eyes. You knew it, but what did you do? Verse 23. You nailed to the cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. Well, why is that, Paul? Verse 29. That no man should boast before God. The fact that we don't always understand God's commands does not mean that they don't work or that they don't have significance to God. On a hot day, 2 little girls, they begged their mother to allow them to go to the nearby store for ice cream cones. Mom gave permission, but only after laying down a list of conditions, especially stressing that they go directly to the store and straight back home. Not to get into a car with anyone, no matter who it was or what they were told or promised. Sure enough, returning home, a car stopped. and the driver asked them to get into his vehicle. They refused. The driver insisted by opening the door and then slamming it shut, and irritated, he sped off because they said no. The reason he was so upset, he was their father. He was on his way home from work, but they had promised Mom not to get in the car or ride with anyone, no matter what. Imagine what might have been going through their little heads. Why doesn't Mommy want us riding with Daddy? Is he such a bad driver without her in the car? There was purpose for Mom's instructions. Although they didn't understand it, they had the spirit of obedience and obey. I have to confess my ignorance because I'd like you to continually think that I'm infallible. But there are some things in the Old Testament that throw me for a loop. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 8 to 10, if a brother-in-law does not perform the duty of marrying his dead brother's wife, she is to take his sandal off and spit in his face. Now I have a handle on the spitting part, as that is a sign of disfavor of a man from the widow. But don't fully comprehend what the sandal has to do with it. Back then, it was understood. But for me, why the sandal? I don't know. Except we are to have the same childlike attitude, the spirit of obedience, and obey any command that pertains to us today. Let us remember that one far greater than us understands all and knows the why. Fifthly, the spirit of obedience is required us to do more than the bare minimum in serving God. Now, had you asked the 10 spies who had been given the negative report back whether they were serving God, they would have boldly said yes. After all, they made the trip to spy out the land. Yet, they did not desire to go back and take the land of Canaan by force from the inhabitants. They wanted an easier way and were willing to either wait for everybody to move off or to die. They wanted to return to Egypt for survival rather than to go through the extra trouble in trying to secure this new land. But again, note the contrast with Caleb. At the end of the wilderness wandering, he still wanted the land where the giants lived. In Joshua 14, verse 7 and 8, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me to Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear. But I followed the Lord fully. Verse 10 and 11. But now, behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke these 45 years from the time that the Lord spoke to Moses when Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am 85 years old today. I still am as strong today as I was in the day when Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now, for war and for going out and coming in. When the 12 spies had returned first from their spy trip, God said, Caleb has followed me fully. Numbers 14:24. Now some 40 years later, Joshua, speaking of Caleb, says he followed the Lord of Israel fully. Joshua 14:14. Caleb had maintained the same spirit of obedience all those years. He was willing to go the distance with God. Jesus told of the second mile in Matthew 5, verse 21. When whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Now this statement was tied in with the Roman occupation customs of first century Palestine. A soldier could use a local native or an animal to help him go forward for 1 mile. Now, can you imagine the difference in each spirit of the Jewish natives who might be compelled to aid these Russian or Roman If I keep saying Russian, you know I'm talking Roman. These Roman pagans. Now, one is viewing it as a grim duty to do the bare minimum, and the other as a golden opportunity to learn some more about a stranger from a distant land, or to tell the individual about the one true living God. One might perform the same service out of love and enjoy it, or endure it with gritted teeth in misery. One in ancient Palestine might lose a whole day's labor going the second mile, but with the spirit of obedience wouldn't care about the personal loss. We need to evaluate carefully the difference in love versus duty, to make sure that our service to Christ is a joy rather than a chore. A woman was married for 2 years to a very intolerable husband. He was insensitive and coercing. Any love she ever felt for him was soon crushed. She existed from one day to the next only by the hardest effort. He denied her companionship and humiliated her by giving a written checklist of daily chores he expected her to do. When he died, she could not truthfully say she mourned him, for she had been released from a sad life of unappreciative servitude. In time, she met a kind man who loved her, and they married. The new joy she felt was as excessive as had the previous sorrow been. She delighted in making her new husband happy. Months passed. She happened one day to be cleaning out a drawer and found a crumpled up slip of paper. When she realized what it was, she felt nauseated. It was a list of the assignments that her first husband demanded that she do. Now, as she read, she felt this same strange strange sensation come over her. The list of chores which she had approached with dread was identical to the things that she was now doing for her new husband with such a joyful desire. What a difference in our service to God will be if we love him. In John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. In 1 John 5:3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. The spirit of loving obedience and serving God will not have us doing the minimum, but the maximum. And finally, number 6, the spirit of obedience requires that we overcome obstacles and every excuse to serve God. The inhabitants and the cities of this new land were an obstacle, as the 10 spies declared in Numbers 13:28. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Verse 30. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we shall by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. No excuses were given from the lips of Caleb. As a matter of fact, Joshua and Caleb were convinced that if the Lord delighted in the Israelites as his people, he would be with them so that they need not use the excuse of fear. Satan will somehow always see to it that we have excuses and opposition to discourage our obedience to God. But the Lord has never promised to accept any of our human rationalizations. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus calls people to serve God with these words, follow me, and to respond in this fashion. Verse 59, permit me first to go bury my father. In other words, I'll serve you, Jesus, but for my Father's sake, it won't be long, and then I'll report for service. Verse 61, I will follow you, Lord, but first permit me to say goodbye to those at home. I'll serve you, Jesus, but allow me to stay for a little while longer because I don't know where obeying God will take me. Both of these men used loved ones as their excuses in not dropping all to come and serve and follow God. And the Lord, in verse 60 and 62, accepted neither of their so-called justifying explanations. Remember in Luke 14, the excuses of the 3 dinner guests? I can't come just now. I've got a new field, a new oxen, new wife. Their regrets are based on the element of something new. To these 3, the things on earth seem sweet and modern compared to God's age-old invitation. Yet the Lord's reaction to all is, none of these will taste of my feast. The 3 apologies warn us not to be hindered by the love of possessions, the affairs of business, or our social ties. No excuse is valid for not obeying the Lord, not even loved ones. Some have not fully served Jesus because those closest to them would not view their decision with favor. A lady attended services for some while without ever obeying the New Testament gospel. When approached by the evangelist, she said, I would like to be a disciple of Christ, but my mother is strongly opposed to my becoming a New Testament Christian, and she's in poor health. I could visualize that if I became a child of God, she might have a stroke, and then when she learns of it, I would be responsible for her death. I have thought that in all probability I will outlive her, and then I can obey later. Now she continued to say that she was not ashamed of Christ and wouldn't care if anybody else other than her mother knew. She even wondered if she could obey the Bible truth without anyone being said to her ailing mother. The preacher says, it is not easy to be a successful secret disciple, for the secrecy will either destroy your discipleship, or your discipleship, if it's worth anything, will destroy the secrecy. She finally decided to obey and let matters take their own course. A few weeks passed, and the evangelist asked her how things turned out with her mother. The lady smiled. Oh, she never did mention it, one way or the other. Sometimes it turns out this way. We allow our imaginations to gain control so that we think the worst, which is the devil working on our fears. Besides, in the name of common sense, no one should be upset when another obeys the New Testament gospel. Why be jealous of Jesus being first place in that person's life? Yet even if the worst did happen, we have no choice but to obey God and give him foremost claim to our service without excuses, if we desire to be found faithful, pleasing to him. This morning, do you have the same spirit of obedience as seen in the faithful life of Caleb and Joshua too? Do you want to obey promptly when you learn of your duty? To obey regardless of what others do or do not do. To obey without regard to your own personal preference. To obey even if you don't fully understand all the whys to everything. To obey carefully and completely rather than to look for a way of minimum service. And to obey in spite of any excuse Satan might be tempting you to use even in this moment. If so, we urge you to follow the Lord with the spirit of obedience, beginning this morning right now. Come believing, repenting, and being baptized in order to remove your sins from God's sight. Will you not come right now as together we stand?